Hello, everyone. My name is Jin S. Kim. I'm founding pastor and senior pastor of Church of All Nations, a Christian community here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're part of the Presbyterian Church USA and a part of the global ecumenical movement, something I've always had a passion for. I've been asked to speak about the Bible for the WSCF, which I'm very happy to do from a post-colonial context. A little bit about our church. I'm not only senior pastor of this congregation, this multicultural church, but I also am founder of Underground Seminary, which started in 2014 to train people, disciples, in a post-colonial context, to decolonize our very bodies from the infection of empire so that we can lead the people of God in a good way. And we're excited to welcome our fourth cohort this fall. It's going to be a really dynamic group. I also help lead 7 community houses that are church-based. And we probably almost a third of our congregation members now live in these 7 community houses. And also I help facilitate 5 church-based businesses, enterprises that are for-profit, that one way or another help to fund our congregational ministry and our various initiatives. And in recent years, we have converted our church grounds. We sit on about 2 acres through permaculture principles, trying to restore the land back to its health and plant flora and cultivate the kind of trees and shrubs and plants and herbs that are native to this area in our commitment to live in a healthy and ecologically sustainable way, because the way of our modern capitalist system is leading us to ecocide, and eventually the viability of humanity is at stake. So those are all things that we take into consideration here at this church. I've been a pastor for almost 30 years in the local church context, and something I enjoy with all my heart. My family also loves the church and serves in a variety of ways. So it's truly something that's the church is integrated into every aspect of my being. And I'm so grateful that I can bring all of myself to the church and believe that the church can be a constructive place for all of who we are and all that the world is. My understanding of that begins with the Bible. So we'll talk about that now directly. So one of the ways that I understand the Bible is through this genealogy of key biblical figures. I first diagrammed this in 1992. I was just entering my 3rd year at Princeton Seminary, and I was leading a bunch of teenagers as part of my seminary internship, and I was trying to get these guys to understand the Bible, right? But the best way to kind of summarize the entire Bible was to chart out the genealogy of one particular family. So we call this this God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham and Sarah here, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel and his other wives. And so Jesus comes from this line, right? But Abraham and Sarah also come from people before them. So this is the kind of the pre-story of their family. And the reason why this is important, because in my opinion, the Bible is just the story of one particular family and how they're navigating the forces of history that are, washing up on the shores of their life, basically, and how to navigate that. So we'll just go back in time to how they understand their original ancestor, Adam and Eve. Now, there are some people, literalists, biblicists, who believe that Adam and Eve go back about 6,000 years. Now, interestingly, I'm not a biblical literalist, but I kind of agree with that. And not because I think the earth is, that young. I actually believe that the earth is over 4 billion years old and the universe over 14 billion years old. However, the story of Adam and Eve and their fall is about some human beings at some point who decided to not trust nature, not trust God's bounty all around them, food that was growing everywhere, and started to take matters into their own hands, to take food that was not good for them, to do things that eventually would lead to accumulation based on greed, distrust, and competition. So for millions of years, we've had hominids on this planet, primates that were walking on two legs. And Homo sapiens emerged about 150 to 300,000 years ago. And we were these peculiar primates with kind of scrawny bodies and extra large heads. And this is why, chiropractors have endless patience, right? Like myself. This is not perfection. This is an awkward phase of our evolutionary development. So we're walking around with these big heads, and nevertheless, we learn to make it in this world and thrive. And one of the ways that Homo sapiens endure and succeed more than other hominids on this planet is because of our sociality, our ability to work together, to care for each other, to offer mutual aid and support. And we know that Homo sapiens, human beings, are the most social creatures on Earth today. We're intensely social and communal. And we learn to live with each other and with the rest of the Earth in relative harmony for hundreds of thousands of years. But anthropologists have recognized that between 5 to 10,000 years ago, about 10,000 years ago, there's something called intensive or surplus agriculture emerged in the Fertile Crescent area, right? So I'll just point you to this map here. So in this area of the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which flows right here to the Persian Gulf, and the Nile. And there are also rivers along here, the Jordan River, for instance. But in this ancient Near East, this area that we call the Fertile Crescent, there were human beings that through, and Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond would be a helpful primer on that, but through a combination of ecological, geographical, topographical, other forces allowed them to engage in surplus agriculture, not subsistence agriculture only, but the ability to create surplus food, store it for later use. That began the process of accumulation for some, deprivation for others, and then hierarchy and power to decide who gets what. Shortly after that is the rise of concentrated villages that would eventually give way to cities, and then city-states, and then a kind of a conglomeration of city-states that would eventually form the Sumerian civilization on this side of the Fertile Crescent, and the Egyptian civilization on the other side of that neighborhood. So Adam and Eve are not a representation of two individuals, but a period in time when human beings stopped living in a natural way with their environment, but began to till the ground and do the kind of surplus agriculture which would eventually lead to a differential in power dynamics among people, where you would have class stratification, wealth stratification, power stratification. And so that is the fall of Adam and Eve. And it may have been about 6,000 years ago, it may have been 10,000 years ago. But that was a time when you see the formation of cities and then civilizations and the abuse of power, basically. So that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. And this kind of abuse of power by concentrating resources and wealth and power, we see in a particular manifestation in the time of Noah. You know, that they have the ziggurat built there, trying to have the power of the gods themselves. And so the story of Abram and Sarai is they lived in Ur, the city right here, which was a major city in the Sumerian civilization in southern Mesopotamia. And they hear the voice of Yahweh, who is a god actually of this Canaanite region in the Levant. So they're hearing a god from all the way on the other side of their world in the Fertile Crescent saying, leave your home and follow me here. So this is the desert, so they're not going to go directly across the desert. They would most likely die there. But they go up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the Assyrian area and then go down the Levant to the place that God had promised to them. So in the heart of modern civilization in their time, so 4,000 years ago, God relocates them to the hill country where they can live more through indigenous values. Now that works out for a few generations, but by the third generation, Jacob, they're starting to have some ecological disruption. There's more drought and more famine. So much so that by the fourth generation, Joseph's time, there's such a famine that they cannot feed themselves here. Egypt had become a great empire, and most of us know the story of how Joseph becomes a prince of Egypt, how he becomes the second most powerful person below Pharaoh. And by the ways that he accumulates and stores food, gains a lot of economic and political power. So he saves his family from ecological disaster by inviting them all to Egypt. Hundreds of years later, the story of Joseph is forgotten among the Egyptian rulers, and the Israelites become convenient class of slaves for all their pyramid building scheme, right? Yes, the pyramid scheme comes from that time period for us. And they become basically slaves, and they cry out to a God that they had forgotten, Yahweh. Yahweh hears them and appoints Moses, who, like his ancestor Joseph, is a prince of Egypt again. But this time, unlike Joseph, who leads his family into Egypt, Moses is called to lead his people out of Egypt. Remember that Moses, although he wanted to lead a resistance movement, has not been trained in the way of God, not been trained in the wild ways of God, a God who is opposed to empire, but works with nature. And so at the age of 40, he is exiled to Midian in this area here, in the desert area east of the Sinai, and trains as a shepherd, as a lowly shepherd for 40 years, mentored by Jethro, his father-in-law, a Midianite priest and shepherd himself. And only after being rewilded, so to speak, does God call Moses to go back to Egypt and to now lead a revolution and call their people out from slavery. And now, it would probably take about 6 months to a year to go from where the Israelites were in Egypt to Canaan, or the Promised Land. But they spent 40 years in Sinai, according to the Bible, because they had slavery in their body, right? They might have been free technically, but they had internalized slavery so much that God, according to the prophets, did not trust the Israelites to leave behind the trauma and the internalized slavery they had in their bodies into the Promised Land. Even Moses didn't make it. So now once they come to the Promised Land, they're there for many generations, but they are threatened by later on by the Philistines. So the Israelites, although they lived under the rule of judges for many years, cry out for a king so that they can organize a permanent military like the nations around them. This does not please God, and Samuel the prophet makes it known to the people that God does not think this is a good idea, and yet because of their insistence, God says, just let them have it. They'll have to learn the hard way. And so first Saul as a chieftain, but then David as a true king, unites the northern and southern bands, the tribes of Israel, and becomes a king and concentrates power, and that means a formal military. And that goes kind of okay at first, but right after David with Solomon and many, many kings after that, both as the kingdom divides again, north and south, we have oppression by the rulers of the Israelite people themselves. So they had been under a foreign empire, the Egyptian empire, but now they have to struggle with the corruption and the oppression of their own internal kings. That gives way in 721 to the Assyrian Empire. They conquer the northern kingdom. 135 years later, the southern kingdom, headquartered in Jerusalem, is conquered by the Babylonian Empire. 40, 50 years after that, the Persians defeat the Babylonians and conquer the Israelite people here, the Judeans primarily. And then a couple hundred years after that, Alexander the Great conquers this entire area, and the Israelites are ruled by one part of the broken up Greek Empire under the Ptolemies that rule out of this area, Egypt. And then 100 years after that, they're ruled by the Seleucids, who operate out of the old Assyrian area. And then in, I believe, is it 63? The Roman Empire conquers the remnant of the Greek Empire, and they dominate here in 63 BCE until Jesus is born. So that's the story of the Bible, is the people of God who came out of the city-state of Ur, an abandonment of the natural way of working with the ecosystem, with God's natural world, and concentrating resources, wealth, and power among those who control the city. God telling them, you got to leave that way behind and live in the hills in a natural way. That lasting about 3-4 generations until, because of the ecological disaster happening in this part of the Fertile Crescent, them moving to the concentration of resources and wealth in Egypt, but then that turning sour, becoming slaves to that system, finding liberation, doing that for a few hundred years until, out of fear, they turn and become themselves a nation state, but suffering under the oppression of now their own kings in the north and the south, until that whole internal monarchy, the Israelite monarchy in the north and south, are destroyed by the Assyrian Empire and then the Babylonian Empire, and then empire after empire after that until the Roman Empire, which is what Jesus is born into. And Jesus is saying that God is calling us to be born again. Not our bodies being born into the ways of empire, of exploitation, resource competition, of individualism, of selfishness, of exploitation of the earth, of our neighbors, even of our own kin, and a return to the village way of life, where people share with one another, care for each other, especially those who are the widows, the orphans, the aliens, those on the margins, those who suffer from whatever disabilities or outsider status. To care for the poor. The good news for the poor is what Jesus preached. And if there's good news for the poor, then there's good news for everyone. So Jesus was bringing about village renewal in his itinerant ministry. And he and his band of women and men disciples were to be a traveling demonstration of a functional village, of a loving village. And by everyone working together and renewing the spirit of village to basically make empire obsolete in their lives without the use of arms, without doing an armed rebellion. Using the tools of empire to overthrow empire usually just creates a new empire. Jesus knew that. And so Jesus is a descendant of David. He's also a descendant of Abraham and Sarah. He's a descendant of Noah and Adam and Eve. And this is the whole story of the Bible, of the fall from the grace of God, the abundance of the natural world, which is the Garden of Eden, into a control of nature. It's the control of nature that leads to the control of other human beings, and that leads to our fall from grace. God has made the entire universe with grace, meaning God's gratuitous love for all things. This is a story of that fall from grace. Adam and Eve are not the first human beings. They're not the first Homo sapiens or hominids. They are a representation of that transition from human beings that had once trusted God and God's bountiful nature and lived in harmony with all creatures to a type of distrust and fear and anxiety and control that would eventually lead to exploitation and oppression. Those of us who see the Bible this way, we're followers of what some scholars call the little tradition. The little tradition is the tradition of the prophets, like Moses and Elijah. Remember that when Jesus was about to face his own death and needed some counsel, needed to get his head screwed on straight, he went to the mountain and was transfigured in his encounter with his spiritual mentors, Moses and Elijah. The prophets of old, the faithful women and men of the Bible, are the ones that Jesus appeals to. Jesus appeals, even though he's called the Son of David, probably ironically, Jesus appeals to those who cared about the oppressed. Jesus drew from the little tradition of village renewal, not the big tradition of kings and queens and emperors. And so we also take sides with the Bible, even though the Bible is rich and varied and has examples of both oppressor and oppressed. We are followers of Jesus, so we side with what Jesus sided with, which is the little tradition that is in the Bible, but is not emphasized in Western Christianity. Because when Constantine basically co-opted the church into the Roman Empire in the 300s, the church, the Western church, has basically emphasized the big tradition in the Bible of the rulers, of the kings and queens and princes ever since. So for 1700 years, the Western church has been co-opted and followed the big tradition. Our church, Church of All Nations, our seminary, underground seminary, clearly sides with Jesus and the little tradition that he emphasized. And for us, that is what it means to have a post-colonial perspective and a post-colonial reading of the entire Bible, understanding history, understanding geography, understanding genealogy, the story of the human family. And even those of us who were born and raised in all different parts of the world can connect in some way to this story, because this story is a story of all humanity. Our ancestors at some point, for hundreds of thousands of years, lived in harmony with God and God's creation and all creatures. And between 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, our ancestors in various parts of the world gave in to fear and anxiety that led to accumulation and exploitation and oppression. So I hope and pray that a new generation of students all over the world will reread the Bible and see the good news that is just right there if we only have eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to understand. May that be so with you, my dear sisters and brothers, and warriors for the future generations. And I mean warriors in the best way, the way that Jesus was. Thank you all. Blessings to you.